Welcome to the Truth of the Comfort Show. Today is returning guest Matthew Hoh, an ex-Afghan and Iraq veteran, now a senior fellow for the Center for International Policy, and we are here to talk about Russia-Ukraine. So first, Matt, I thought I wanted to get your thoughts on when do you feel this conflict started? Was it in February, or was it before that, and was it justified?
Well, I mean, I think it's you'd be hard pressed to pick an actual start date, right? In the sense of the divisions between, excuse me, Russians and Ukrainians. That if you're a historian of the era or just a general, just have the general knowledge, understand that this goes back centuries, and you can see that in the way that both sides, the Russians and Ukrainians, point to things that predate us by generations. So I think for a Western audience, an audience in the UK, an audience in the United States, a NATO audience, if you will, I think the appropriate point is probably begin after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And then the relationship between the United States, particularly, and Russia, that gets very difficult through the 90s because of, as the Russians would say, the American looting and plundering of Eastern Europe and Russia. And I mean, so obviously I say this with a grain of salt in the sense that there are always multiple sides to every story. But in the case of, say, this antagonism that arises from the Russians over the American actions in the years following the breakup of the Soviet Union, I think there's a lot of justification for that, and there's certainly a ton of evidence that the Americans came in, American bankers came in and tried to loot Russia, there's people will discuss how this, and in the American placing of Boris Yeltsin, as the leader of Russia, that humiliation Russians felt. There's a lot of argumentation that says this is how you end up with a Vladimir Putin. And also too, though, it's you have to remember, though, if you go back 20 some odd years, 22 years or so, you will see in the American press a fawning admiration for Vladimir Putin, that this is the guy who's going to right Russia. And you go and you look and you see, particularly the years 2000, 2001, 2002, how the American press spoke highly of him. But then you start to get into the Bush years. You start to get into disagreements over particularly missile defense, the withdrawal by the Bush administration from the anti-ballistic missile treaty, which was nothing other than billions upon billions, tens upon tens of billions of dollars of giveaways to the American military industrial complex. You had the continued enlargement of NATO, which occurred all throughout the 90s, continued into the early parts of the century, in a manner that the list of American and European diplomats, former politicians, generals, whoever, said this is dangerous, this is wrong. You are going to cross some very real Russian red lines here, and the consequences are not worth the expansion of NATO. The consequences are not worth the ability of you to sell eventually F-35s to Ukraine, or because I think a lot of us look at the expansion of NATO as the primary goal being that expansion of U.S. and European military sales into Eastern Europe. So I mean, you have all this, and you have quite clearly where the Russians pushed back in 2007 and 2008, whether it be at the Munich Security Conference in 2007 or at the NATO conference in 2008 in Romania, where the Russians, through their president, Vladimir Putin, quite clearly are saying, look, this is a red line for us. You are crossing into, you are contemplating something here that we cannot accept. This is a danger to us. So you continue to have all those types of what you would say provocations, instigations, pushing, bullying. I mean, that is how the Russians would depict it as, and I think objective observers take that view as well, including again many men and women, and the list is long: Kissinger, Talbot, Albright, Kennan. I mean, the list is quite long of American former government officials, diplomats, military officers, whoever, who warned against such a thing as provoking a war in Ukraine. And then, of course, you fast forward to 2014, you have the overthrow of the elected government of Ukraine that if the Americans were not fully involved, they were certainly supporting. There's a lot of evidence for that, including a leaked telephone call between the head of the American European Affairs for the State Department, Victoria Nuland, and the American ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Pyatt. So there's a lot of those types of events. At the same time, the pushing that was going on around the world against Russia. So not just the actions in Ukraine, but as well as the expansion of the missile defense systems from Romania into Poland, the expansion of the American army into back into Europe, coming out of Afghanistan and Iraq, putting more troops back into Europe. Commentary from Washington, D.C., as well as London, that the Russians, depending on who is talking, sometimes they say the Chinese, but the Russians are our threat. These wars in the Middle East were a mistake. They are a distraction. The real threat has been and always will be Russia or China, depending upon, sometimes they say both, right? I mean, so you had all these things, and then you had the war in Syria, where the West was trying to overthrow Russia's ally. And Russia said, stop or we'll intervene. And in 2015, they intervened and they kept Assad in power. And the same thing, too, you had these occurrences, say, with the war in Georgia, where there's a lot of American involvement in that, a lot of American support for Georgia going to war with Russia. In the summer of 2008, John McCain, who's the Republican presidential contender, or the Republican presidential nominee in the U.S., is fiercely advocating for the U.S. to enter into that war between Georgia and Russia. I mean, that would have been madness. That would have been absolute madness. And so you had it's one of those kind of sense of all the type of rhetoric, the pushing, the bullying, as the Russians would describe it, that leads up to 2014, the coup, and then of course Russia responds by taking Crimea and by supporting an insurgency or a civil war in the eastern part of Ukraine. And then, of course, you have years of that civil war. You have an agreement in 2015, the Minsk II agreement, that brings violence down quite a bit, particularly among civilians. So
Can you explain what the Minsk agreement was and the parties?
Sure. There's a Minsk I and then finally a Minsk II, which I think was agreed upon in March of 2015. So about a year or so into the fighting in eastern Ukraine, this agreement was between Russia and Ukraine, but had a heavy role played by the Germans and the French. And then the Americans really dragged their feet on it. In Washington, D.C., there was a very real degree, a really real sense that this is not what we want. And this was at the time that the American administration, the Obama administration, was under heavy pressure to send weapons to Ukraine to really, and the Minsk II agreements between Russia and Ukraine were such that, one, there'd be ceasefires, but then the other parts of it were the political parts, which is ultimately what the wars and most or all wars are about, the politics of it. And so it was the neutrality of the eastern Ukraine, basically creating eastern Ukraine into a semi-autonomous zone, and you had neutrality overall for Ukraine as well. That Ukraine, these were the kind of things that the Russians have wanted. This, I think, was fairly reasonable for a lot of people, particularly in Europe. Both sides were not great about implementing the agreement, but it worked to a degree. in the years running up to the February 2022 invasion by Russia, so a year ago. In those parts of it started to fall apart, and particularly in the year prior to the invasion, you saw an increase in violence, an increase, say, in artillery shelling or whatnot. But for most of the years from 2015 up until then, that agreement largely held. Of course, there was still violence, but if you look at the numbers of casualties, the 15,000 people killed prior to the February 22 invasion by Russia, you have most of those deaths occurring in the first year or so of the conflict before Minsk II was really implemented. So it was successful in many ways, and there was a path forward. It wasn't a perfect path, but it was a path forward that if all sides had adhered to, I don't believe these circumstances would be in place now, where you have this absolutely catastrophic and pointless war that is, ruining the lives of tens of millions of people. Has killed God knows how many, and the great fear, of course, is that it will escalate, and wars are breeding grounds for unintended consequences. And so, what will come out of a further escalation of the war is something that nobody knows. Anyone who tells you they know where this war is going, they're either complete fools or they're lying to you. There's probably on either side a handful of officers on either side who have a good picture of what's happening in this war, and so anyone who's talking to you with like certainty that this is going to happen, they don't know. I mean, the only certainty is that if it escalates, it will escalate in a manner that's not controllable, right? Not unknowable, right? The consequences may be worse than anything you could have predicted, and certainly look at all the different cases of war throughout the world. Look at the American experiences, with the wars in Iraq and the wars in Afghanistan, the wars in Syria, the escalation of those wars, what that brought about, the escalation of the war in Libya. What did that war bring about? So, I think that you get to this point now where we're almost a year into the war and we're in this deadly I'm sitting here drinking coffee in North Carolina, but the Ukrainians and Russians are in this awful stalemate where either side will make advances. And now, I mean, being discussed, this Russian looks like near Russian victory in Soledar and Bakhmut. Now we all know these cities, right? We all know these cities and towns of regions that a year ago I would have thought that was a misspelling of Baku or something like that, right? But Bakhmut, and I mean, so we're all like now these experts, and we don't know anything about it. And I think we have to approach this with a humility that we don't really understand what's happening there, because it's such a heavy propagandized war. It's so difficult to get good reporting, get good information. I think the best thing we can do is try and understand what's occurring there and temper it with what we know about past wars, what we know that conflict is like, with what we know that war is like, and try and use that to get an understanding of what has been occurring and where it might go.
Just to circle back for people who aren't familiar, do you think it was a US coup in 2014 or just US supporters? I'm pretty sure John McCain and Victoria Nuland, who you referenced in that leaked audio, didn't they go to the protests while it's happening? Is it just more support from the West rather than an actual coup that they, started themselves?
Right. A number of American officials, whether they be members of Congress or administration officials, State Department officials, appeared and supported at the rallies against the Ukrainian government in late 2013, early 2014. Famously, Victoria Nuland, who is now the number 3 person at the American State Department. She's in charge of political affairs for the State Department. She was famously handed out cookies to people in the Maidan, in the big square in the center of Kyiv, right? So there has been since the early 90s, and this is from Nuland herself, but also it's interesting though, because a lot of this information has since disappeared. If you go to the website for the National Endowment for Democracy, which is really kind of a front for the CIA in many different ways, and if you go and you look at where there have been coups and regime change operations and things like that in the past 30, 40 years or so, you'll see the National Endowment for Democracy has almost always been there in a very robust sense. So they have been used as a Trojan horse, if you will, with the trappings of we are there to teach people how to do democracy. We're just there to teach, we're just there to help people organize elections and to learn about how to have a constitutional government responsible to the people. We don't do anything bad, but you've seen it over and over again. And the saying is because through NED and other organs of the U.S. government, more than $5 billion have been spent on democracy type work in Ukraine since the end of the Cold War. So it's a lot of money, and so you had all that. You have allegations that the U.S. Embassy was providing support, that they were training people. You certainly have a lot of connections that are apparent between some of the most right-wing elements that were the most violent elements, and that led to the dissolution of the, and that violence really led to the dissolution of the Ukrainian government in February 2014. So you have all those ties. It's clear you have this leaked telephone recording between Newland and the American ambassador in Ukraine, Jeffrey Pyatt, that basically kind of predicts what's going to happen, and also too, context-wise, fits very well into their conversation, fits into the dismissal by the U.S. government of attempts by the European Union to negotiate some type of settlement between the protesters and the Ukrainian government. One of the things about Ukraine is it's been very split. So what you had, say, in the elections in this century in Ukraine was you saw a clear split between East and West Ukraine, between the Russian-speaking people of the East and the Ukrainian-speaking people of the West. I mean, it's not all that simple as everyone understands, but when you look at it, you see, okay, here's this clear division. And so you can see that over the years, that division was utilized by various political actors and organizations within Ukraine to cause division, to cause strife. I mean, I think that's kind of, you're going to see that anywhere. And so the American relationship with some of those most extreme groups that represent Western Ukraine, to simplify it, right, was something that falls in line with how the United States has operated in dozens of countries around the world for decades. It is part of the divide and conquer strategy that the U.S. has used throughout its history. We got this from the British, right? And so that type of fracturing of Ukrainian society in order to achieve a political objective is exactly how the American CIA, the American, the Pentagon, the State Department, those who conduct regime change, overthrow of governments, invasions, occupations, how they operate, through that strategy of divide and conquer in order to achieve their goal of capturing control of the government for its purposes. And then that division, that fractured, any violence that comes to it, well, that just rather helps in many ways keep control, because now you can crack down, now you can provide military support. Right now there's an urgency to it. And of course, the danger is that it spirals out of control, like in Iraq would be the absolute best case in that, or CC here in Ukraine, where you have another adversary under the side, Russia, who won't back down and who eventually does something when you cross a line, say a stage a coup and remove their ally, they intervene and they take Crimea and they send forces into eastern Ukraine, support this civil war there. And, why we thought the Russians were ever going to back down over these last years, why we thought that just pushing them was going to somehow achieve our policy goals, I don't know, because you see how the Russians reacted with Georgia, you see how they reacted with Syria, you see how they reacted with Ukraine. You stage a coup and they take Crimea. Why do you think that 8 years down the line they're going to have relaxed a bit, that they're going to have chilled out right? And they're not going to respond to your provocations, and there were attempts by rapprochement by, Zelensky, when he's elected a few years ago, he comes in as someone who ran on promises of reconciling, of ending the war in eastern Ukraine, of rebuilding relationships with Russia. And once he comes into office, and I think this comes from a lot of American and British pressure through these various right-wing groups that the Americans and British are allied with or have good connections with, he quickly sees that that's not a possibility, that the powers that are behind the Ukrainian government, military, paramilitary, economic, they are not going to allow such a reconciliation, that they prosper from this friction. And you get to the point even in the months before the Russian invasion where the Russians are providing draft an opportunity to negotiate or draft settlements. Here's our proposal for what we can do to because remember again that in 2021 the violence in Ukraine renews and things are getting bad there. So what you have the Russians doing in the late fall, early winter of 2021 is trying to offer some type of pathway. Whether or not it was going to ever be acceptable, whether or not it was complete garbage is not the point.
Yeah.
I mean, you don't go into a negotiation offering, to give up things. You always go in saying, this is what we want. And then that's the purpose of negotiation is, both sides go in. It's a question of, I just heard this said the other day with negotiations. It's not about winning. It's about losing as little as possible. And that's how I think mature adults understand negotiations. Unfortunately, I don't think we have that in London, Washington, Kyiv at this point. So, we had all these things, tumult, right? And all these things combined, it's one step after another that leads us to, February 24th of last year, and the Russians launch an invasion, which, has just been absolutely awful. And everything I've said up until now that clearly saying that there was provocations by the West, by the Americans that instigated things, staged coups. None of that, of course, allows for an invasion by one nation of another. So
I was going to ask that. I was going to say all the provocations, the expansion of NATO, and then even after 2014, obviously Russia takes Crimea. Like, this is a red flag. They're like, well, we're going to train them. We're going to arm them at like thousands. I mean, you can hear British officials, US, Canadian, kind of like almost bragging about how many they've trained. They have it on their websites. I think it was mainly Canada, the US, and the UK, probably some other NATO forces under the banner of NATO. Do you think that isn't enough to justify? Because obviously there's a lot of people on the anti-war side who are so obviously against NATO, the US, and everything they do, that they're sort of maybe giving them Russia too much of a free pass of justifying the invasion. I don't think they justify it as in they're okay with it, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, I think you all in Britain are I don't know if you're as bad as we are here in the U.S., but everything has been simplified down into a binary construct. It's always A versus B. It's always in red versus blue, red for Republicans, blue versus Democrat. And there's no ability to have a conversation larger than that. There's no ability to bring in context or nuance or to have, any type of anything other than this very simple A versus B. And that, of course, fits well into like a Manichaean structure, right, of good versus evil. And that's what you have with the Russian war. If you just start the clock, kind of as we were talking about when we started this conversation, you start the clock on this thing on February of last year. Of course, the Russians are on the wrong side. Of course, right? I mean, absolutely. But if you start to bring in other aspects of it, it all. This is why it's so important. What's your start date for history? And this is one of the things that I think, case in point, in my example, in my experiences, with the war in Afghanistan. The number of fellow Americans that I worked with, even on the anti-war side, who were just so rigid in their when they spoke about Afghanistan, worked on it, thought about it, that this is something that is a post 9/11 event. right? That the previous decades of civil war, occupation, that somehow doesn't compute, doesn't matter, isn't worth commenting on, and doesn't need to be taken into your estimation of the current situation. I mean, which is just insane. I don't think any of us in our lives would ever do that. Be like, nothing for me before the age of 37 matters. Nothing happened that, I mean, like, right. I mean, like, no, we don't live like that. And we don't, also in our history, we talk about our history, here in the United States. I live in the South, and there are plenty of people who would have coronary if you were to say that the American Civil War has no presence on modern American society. People would have a heart attack if you were to suggest that, because it's true. It totally does. And that war was, a war ended in 1865, right? So 160 years ago or whatever. And it's, I mean, like, but when we put our, with these other events outside our borders, or, certainly I think for political purposes, and then the media, the way the media is structured, that they want a simpler, tighter, easier story to tell, and they love the good versus evil. They love the A versus B. They love the red versus blue, right? Which team are you on? Which side are you on? I mean, somehow, it's very inane, because you look at the discussions of this war in the United States, and it is like this completely devoid of context, nuance, history, any type of I don't want to say sophistication to the argumentation or the discussion, but any type of detail to it, and anything that's complex, anything that might upend an existing narrative. And that's why Russia, anything that might upend an existing narrative is just dismissed. It's ignored, it's problematic, and this is why Russia is such a great adversary for the United States, because you've had a history, just like you all did, and you had a much longer history in Britain with Russia, the bear, as an adversary. And this is why you all invade Afghanistan in the 19th century, because you're claiming that the Russians are going to invade India through Afghanistan. The Russians never planned to do that, but that was it, right? I mean, so you launched these wars and invasions and occupations of Afghanistan in the 19th century because of Russia. Right. I mean, and so then, of course, when the Bolsheviks take power, now in America, that really gets us very concerned, particularly Wall Street, because, my God, if the workers here, due to what they did to the Tsar and his people in Russia, we're all in a lot of trouble, well-deserved trouble. But, we're in a lot of trouble. So, I mean, you've had this adversary, this buildup, this narrative, this conditioning of American, British understanding of who Russia is and how they are always the adversary. So, to try and undo that, to try and unwrap that, to try and get on, say, CNN or BBC, right, and talk about this for 2.5 minutes, how do you do it? And they don't want that either. One, it's complicated, but also two, the Western media is so tied to the NATO U.S. narrative of this war for a lot of different reasons. And just the same way too, I try and look at Russian media as much as possible, and it's complete garbage, complete nonsense. Best thing you can do is you can find two stories that sort of overlap from the West and from Russia. You put them together, you do kind of a Venn diagram, and you try and figure out where the overlapping truths are. It's complete nonsense. I mean, just so that's why I'd say people who speak about these wars with this war with any degree of certainty, as if they know where it's going, and particularly if they've been commentating of the wars of the last 20 years and have been dead wrong about them, like most media commentators have been, I'd say to folks to be very suspect of what you're hearing.
Yeah, people definitely do get stuck in that. We're the good side, they're the bad side because they invaded. You can say, oh, I disagree with us, provoking them, expanding NATO, but I also disagree with Russia invading. It can be, you can live in both worlds, but people obviously find it hard to do that. I mean, it's like even in the 80s, we go from supporting Saddam Hussein against Iran to a couple of years later, George H.W. Bush, who was part of that Reagan administration, saying he's Hitler. And then I don't understand how you can go from that to that, but people obviously seem to forget. But I mean,
we do it all the time. We did it with the United States did it with Panama when I was a senior in high school. So when I was 17 years old, 18 years old, we had U.S. had to send forces into Panama to get rid of Manuel Noriega, who
George
had been
H.W. Bush.
right, George H.W. Bush, who had worked with Noriega when he was the director of the CIA in the 70s, right? Because Noriega was a CIA asset, and and I mean, and then we turned as soon as it became uncomfortable and convenient, we turned on him. We just had that happen this year, and I think you all did as well recently in Britain in terms of any types of assistance that our Congress could have done for Afghan refugees. They just completely threw their hands up in the air and abandoned it. And I think your parliament's about the same with that as well, if I'm familiar with it. But so these folks who fought and bled with us for the better part of 20 years, and then they probably had some history going back before that through the Civil War and the war against the Russians, maybe, or at least their families did in terms of being connected to us somehow, the Americans and the British, and then of course what occurs in Afghanistan, the U.S. retreat from there, and then these people who were promised and then who put their lives on the line for us, and I think you can appreciate what they did without taking a side in that conflict or weighing. But that's another war. It's a good war to analyze in the sense that there were no good sides. I think that's what you come back to with the Ukraine war, which is so hard for people, again, this good versus evil structure, is that there are no good sides here. And so the discussions keep being about either the past, right? People trying to say, this is why Russia's evil. This is why the U.S. and Britain and NATO are no good imperialist, conquestors. I mean, and both can be true. But the lack of discussion we have is about, okay, what do we do going forward? And oftentimes it gets dominated then by talks of, is Germany going to give Ukraine Leopard tanks or not? Right? I mean, as if the 15 tanks are somehow going to make a difference in the outcome of this war. But that's how the mindset is, the discussion is, and that allows for the media to have a narrative that's strictly controlled. Meanwhile, there's almost no discussion about, okay, how do you end this war? How do you find negotiations? Which is frustrating, I think, for a lot of us, because that's what we want to talk about. How do you end this thing? What can we do going forward? What's possible to end it? And in the U.S., I mean, if you, and I would imagine it's the same in Britain. If you didn't follow independent media sources, if you weren't watching Al Jazeera or TRT or something like that, so watching the Qataris or the Turks of all people, you would have no idea that there have been prisoner swaps, and that the Russians and Ukrainians meet, and that there are attempts at maybe talking and everything else, because the Western media doesn't want to report that because that complicates the narrative.
Okay, I want to just move on to the next part of, obviously we've talked about leading up to the invasion, the different sides. Just how involved is the US, the UK, and NATO in Ukraine? Obviously, there's reports in the New York Times, the Washington Post, that we're giving them intelligence. They have a training hub in Germany where they're almost directing it, and they're coming in and out of Ukraine. Obviously, everyone knows about the huge amount of arms. America giving about 110 billion. I think Britain probably up to 4 billion. Everyone knows about this, but actually on the ground, and even see videos of what looks like English speaking, so American or wherever it is, soldiers. Obviously, we don't really know if that's true, but just how involved are we, and how much of a risk is that? And what do you think Russia's reaction to that has been so far?
I think it's a danger, like any kind of escalation, right? Escalation is a ladder. You can go up it or you can go down it. You can't go side to side, right? It doesn't work that way. And so when you just do things that might seem rather innocuous, of we're going to train, this was the news in the last day or two in the United States, that they're going to send over a handful of Ukrainians to the U.S. to learn how to operate the Patriot missile batteries, that's a whole other, I think that'd be a good case study in the fascination and the euphoria over the Patriot missile, one Patriot missile battery that the U.S. is going to send. Again, it's going to have no impact on the war. And it is the focus of discussion in the U.S. about the war, right? But they're going to bring up, so even that type of escalation, though, because when you bring over 15, 20 Ukrainians to train on the system, that, of course, you've now passed the line you hadn't gone before, where you're bringing people over here. This is just one example of many you can give, right? But the other thing too is that when that doesn't work, when that doesn't help, well, what's the next step going to be? It's not going to be trained 15, it's going to be trained 30, or it's going to be trained 60, right? Or it's going to be trained, bringing other people over to train in other different types of weapons, right? Or sending, I mean, like, so every time you escalate the war, two things happen. One, the enemy always counter escalates. They always do. They never not do that. I mean, when I was in the Iraq War and I was doing a lot of counter IED work, so going out looking for IEDs, roadside bombs, and we bring in new technologies all the time to try and help us find these roadside bombs. And we estimated that within 30 to 45 days, whatever device we brought in, whatever tactic we had utilized to try and help us find and defeat these IEDs, the insurgents within 30 or 45 days would have developed a countermeasure to our countermeasure. I mean, it was that rapid. It was just the most insane form of competition, the most severe form of competition you could see. Let me give you an example. We brought into Afghanistan these they're called Huskies, and they had a big radar, ground penetrating radar on the front of them. Funny looking vehicles, right? And so they were out there for not more than a couple days. And within the week of those vehicles being there, they had found paint cans and, dug into the road that the insurgents had buried to certain depths to see how far down the ground penetrating radar could find them. Right. I mean, this was within the week, within 3 or 4 days of those things showing up in Afghanistan, they were already being countered by the insurgency. I mean, so when this is what's up with escalation, where does it go? If that doesn't work, then what do you do next? And you're playing into the crowds that want the war. You're playing into the cliques that are cheering this on, that are demanding escalation. And when your escalation doesn't work more, you escalate further. You have to satisfy them again. You've already given in to them. So, I mean, this is the danger. And this escalation of what's happening in Ukraine really starts when Trump comes into office, because Obama, to his credit, does not send weapons to Ukraine. He sends other kinds of assistance, radios, and certainly we had forces over there training. We had military and CIA there training. Just as a lot of other nations did. The Canadians were there, the Brits were there. Yeah. I mean, so, you had that type of escalation. Where does it go? Where is it going to end up at? When, again, it's a ladder. If you don't go down that ladder, you just keep going up. And, certainly the U.S. role there right now, the overtraining that was occurring as soon as Russia invaded, the U.S. pulled those forces out. But at the same time, too, both JSOC, the American Special Operations, which also includes a lot of European Special Operations forces, because you have those relationships from working in Libya, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan together. So it really is a joint effort in the sense of a NATO effort on the Special Operations side. These guys all know each other. They're all friends now. They've killed and they've been killed with one another for years. So you have that Special Operations and CIA intelligence presence that's there. You also are going to, I believe, start seeing much more contractor support, because as the Americans push forward and the Brits and the Germans and the French push forward various pieces of equipment for the Ukrainians to use, you need people to maintain those pieces of equipment. And it can take anywhere from 3 months, 6 months, a year for someone to know how to operate a system, or even longer for someone to know how to maintain it and fix a system. So Germany sends over the Leopard tanks. Who's going to fix them? Who's going to work on them? Who's going to be doing that preventive maintenance that you need on vehicles like that continuously to make sure they run? So I think you're going to see a lot more contractors going over as well to support these weapon systems, but, and then certainly, of course, you have operations that have been conducted, whether it was the destruction of the Nord Stream 2 pipelines, the destruction of the Kerch Bridge. There's a journalist here in the U.S., a guy named Jack Murphy, who's got some pretty good credentials. I would trust what he says based on his background, who wrote a piece a month or so ago about how the CIA has been utilizing another European intelligence agency to conduct sabotage operations in Russia. So you have all those types of things, I think, like you would suspect you would have, but you've also had some pretty spectacular attacks that, again, the Kerch Bridge bombing, the Nord Stream pipeline bombings, which have, of course, led to a further escalation. So, in the U.S., when they talk about how the Russians have been striking at Ukrainian energy infrastructure, and it's cold and people are freezing in their homes and everything, and it's left out that they weren't doing that until the Kerch Bridge was destroyed, right? Or until the pipelines were hit.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. We can talk about Nord Stream 2 and 1 in a little while, but just since you mentioned it, I'd have a question about Russia and the bombing infrastructure, because I've heard Scott Ritter and General Conor, I can't remember, McGregor, no, Conor
McGregor, yeah.
Yeah, saying that basically Russia has been quite lenient so far in civilian infrastructure. Obviously, with Iraq, there was the shock and awe campaign.
Right.
He spoke about in Kosovo, where you hit all the military targets and then you finish with them, and then there's like, well, then you take out the water and the electricity because the army needs that, not just the people, and then you end up just running out of targets. So you bomb all the bridges, you bomb everything you can. Obviously, they bombed, I think it was the Serbia media operations in that time, and I think accidentally the Chinese embassy. So what is your assessment of Russia? Because this isn't my assessment. I've listened to them because they obviously have a military background, saying they have been fairly lenient until recently, as part of the escalations.
Let me let my dog in because he's barking, but hang on one second. I think McGregor and Ritter are right, and I think that there was even around March or April of last year, there was reporting in the New York Times or Washington Post coming out of the Pentagon, where defense intelligence people were saying, "Hey, look, the Russians are not using their air power as they could be. The number of their missile strikes is very limited, particularly when you compare it to, say, U.S. or NATO operations. The air war against Iraq, the air war in the Balkans, the air war in Libya, what was done to eastern Syria and western and northern Iraq in the years 2014 through 2018. I mean, American Air Force and Navy destroyed every city in eastern Syria and western and northern Iraq during those years. I mean, destroyed them. So certainly the comparison is a worthwhile one. But I think this is what occurs, though, as well. Again, it's escalation, that the Russians have to respond to these attacks, say the Kerch attack, the pipeline attack, but then also too, they have to respond to the fact that their strategy has not brought the Ukrainians to the table in the way that I think they wanted, right? I think that they expected, that they hoped for, at least. That was their plan. So I think that the assessments are correct in that they have been limited. It could be a lot worse, but I think it's also correct to say that in the last few months, they have escalated attacks on infrastructure that they had avoided prior, right? So, I mean, that's the thing. You look at the spring and the summer, and the attacks just weren't there on the energy infrastructure, on the water treatment plants, on the various types of things. Now, case in point, in Iraq, the U.S. destroyed everything, and we are still destroying even the things that we didn't destroy. I mean, I can tell you in 2005 in Western Iraq, the United States Air Force destroyed all the bridges that were crossing the Euphrates because we wanted to deny the insurgency the ability to utilize those bridges. So stupid, of course, because it also denied us the ability to use those bridges. I mean, it's absolutely, I mean, I'm not making that up. I mean, like, that was a much bigger problem for us than it was for the insurgents. And we ended up having to try and rebuild those bridges. And it was, but, the, where it goes in the sense of how do you escalate next? And then particularly too, I think once you have a stalemate And I think the Russians, I would expect maybe the Russians achieve their operational goals in the next few months to solidify the hold on what they have in eastern Ukraine, to solidify that portion of eastern Ukraine that connects Donbass through down to Crimea, that they solidified that. They're certainly putting in a lot of fortifications, certainly putting in things, we call it defense in depth. And then their operations seem to be trying to throw the Ukrainians out of certain areas without, though, trying to have a final and decisive victory, if that makes sense. So I think, but where do they go, though, after that? And what do you do in the sense of how does the war further escalate? And how do you put pressure on your enemy, on your adversary, to come to the table? And then you start getting into, well, now we have to talk about really putting hurt, really putting pain on the Ukrainian people in order to drive the Ukrainian government to the table. And the Ukrainians and NATO will say that about Russia. I mean, that was the purposes of the sanctions. This idea that we're going to do these sanctions. It's going to hurt the Russian economy, and the Russian people are going to revolt against it, and they're going to pull down the Putin government. Or at the very least, Putin will have to pull out of Ukraine because everyone's so unhappy back home. And so you do. Ultimately, it keeps coming down to how do we punish people? How do we make them hurt? And that only, I think, increases and intensifies the longer the war goes on.
How do you think the sanctions actually gone? Because I'm not having looked too close.
It doesn't look too good. It doesn't look too good. I mean,
as in, I think too good on the American side of sanctioning Russia rather than Russia.
Right. I think the Russians were much better prepared for this. One thing the Russians, if they were smart, and seems to have been that way, study the U.S., UK, NATO playbook for these wars. We're giving them plenty of examples. Study how the Americans have treated Russia, but also deal with China, deal with Venezuela, deal with Iran, and understand what do they have at their disposal to be able to hurt us economically and financially. And, and it seems as if it has not been effective nearly in any way that the Americans and the British had hoped it would be. The response, particularly from other nations, has been disappointing to Washington, D.C. You have seen, whereas nations have not jumped onto the sanctions, it seems as if the only people who are adhering to the sanctions are those who feel that they somehow themselves will be hurt by them. But you have nations like Turkey, like India, China, of course, that have not just continued their import of Russian energy, grains, weapons, what have you, but they've expanded it. And you can even see with this whole nonsense with oil price caps, how many nations are ignoring that. And the fact that a lot of that has got, you look at that, you pull it apart, how is this ever going to be effective? The price cap is actually above what oil has been selling for. So the Russian economy has been doing quite well this last year. Many different ways it seems to have stabilized. Seems as if they were prepared for it. They had a depth to their industry. Last year, 10 months ago, when the sanctions were being announced, people, this is going to crash the Russian economy because their industry won't be able to get spare parts. Well, turns out they're getting them. The Chinese are still selling it to them. The Indians are still selling it to them. And they had a much greater depth to their critical industries than we ever knew. Every month I just saw a story the other day from CNN about how Russian artillery fire has dropped by 75%. And this means the Russians are running out of artillery. I mean, there's been a story like that every 2 weeks in the American press. I mean, ever since the beginning of the war, the Russians have been running, right? I mean, it has not had the effect. The Russian ruble seems to be stable. The amount of money, the Russian, their balance of trade, I should say, is surplus. $300 or $400 billion in the black for them this year. So the Russian economy is doing quite well, and really has shown the American sanction warfare to be very anemic. And it certainly has not brought about the political results of getting Russian people to be so deprived by these sanctions that they are turning against their government. Certainly there's discontent with the Russian government by the Russian people, of course, but because of the sanctions, it's not working that way.
Yeah, the media reports definitely seem more likely just to keep NATO poplins on side of why there's a cost of living crisis going on in pretty much everywhere, Europe, UK, I'm not sure about the US, I'm sure in certain parts, that we keep sending billions. I think it's just, oh no, Ukraine do have a chance. Russia isn't doing well. I guess this money isn't in vain. It's, defending a good cause. I think it's that, the Telegraph, I don't really follow too much, obviously, the newspapers, but just when it pops up, the Telegraph seem to have one pretty much every week about. But I'm going to move to the Nord Stream question, as the media reaction to that was interesting initially, and since, because it's been pretty much radio silence, which, there was the debate, did Russia do it? Did obviously a NATO country do it? But the reaction since of basically silence. The fact there's an investigation being done by Denmark, Sweden, and Germany, all separately. They're not doing a joint one, all separately, and it's been complete, obviously, silence. You've had the Polish member of parliament at the time who posted that nice picture on Twitter thanking the US, who actually has in his profile picture on Twitter a picture with Joe Biden, which was obviously interesting. What are your thoughts on the Nord Stream pipeline? Obviously, since there has been accusations that it was Britain rather than obviously the US, I'm open to who it could be. It could be Ukrainians on behalf of, the Americans, the British, or it would be a big risk, us doing it directly, but who knows? There was that training going on that people have pointed out with the British and American deep diving for mines. And those things. So what are your thoughts on it? I'm keeping my mind open to, I'm not going to say it was one person, but, if you was a betting man, who would you?
It would a coordinated effort, a coordinated effort by the Americans, the British. I can't imagine the Danes weren't somehow at least aware of it, as well as too, you've got a number of look, these smaller European nations, they want to matter. They want to be part of the big club. They want to take part in these things. And, you look at the Danes' role in Afghanistan, they were very aggressive. They had a small detachment there, the Danes, but at one point they had the highest per capita casualties of any member of the ISAF forces in Afghanistan were the Danes. And, when I was in Denmark speaking against the war, there was a lot of people were against the war, probably the majority of people, but there was this, cadre within Denmark that saw like this is a way to make Denmark matter. And this is the same, you see this with Australians, the Swedes. All these nations, not the Australians so much, but the Swedes or the Danes, or, they have their old statues of their old admirals, in their squares and stuff like that. They have a history of being empires, right? So I think it touches something that we can matter again. So that's why I think it'd be very likely that their intelligence services, their special operations people, and then, their foreign ministries would be involved in this to a degree. I don't know if it was the British or not. I don't know if we'll ever know. I don't know. And I don't know if the Brits have a capability to do something like that the Americans don't. But again, like I was saying earlier, on the special operations intelligence side, these guys have been working together in war now for 20 years. Very close relationships have been built. And so it would surprise me more if it was a single actor than if it was a group of nations that did this. And I think there is certainly from the American side, one is we hate those pipelines. The U.S. hates those pipelines, and we just had the news just broke a couple weeks ago that the United States is now the world's largest exporter of liquid natural gas, right? And yeah.
Could you sorry just touch on the I'm sure everyone watching this is familiar, but what were the previous statements from American officials about the Nord Stream pipeline, and then touch on the LNG? And just before that, I thought I'd mention there was a Polish-Norway pipeline that opened fairly closely
Right, that's right.
after that. So you have Norway too. Obviously, Jens Stoltenberg, the head of NATO, is from Norway. He was their old prime minister as well.
Right.
Interesting connections there. Just thought I'd touch on
Right. And I'm blanking on the name of the guy who was the previous NATO Secretary General. He was Danish.
that. I'm
But yeah, no, I mean, so you had, I think that you had a number of comments that I have to paraphrase from American officials over the years with regards to Nord Stream that it wasn't going to happen. We're not going to allow it to happen, and including the current president Joe Biden saying it's not going to it's not going to last. I can't remember exactly what he said, but he basically said we're going to shut this thing down one way or another.
And he has the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz next to him, and they're in a press conference.
Right.
And then the report was like, "How are you going to stop it?" It's like,
yeah,
we'll find a way.
But if people remember when Donald Trump was president, he went to maybe it was a G7 meeting or whatnot a number of years ago, and he got into a big fight with Angela Merkel and everything else, and that had a lot to do with Nord Stream pipelines. Also had a lot to do with Trump was very upset that the Western Europeans were not upgrading their port facilities to accommodate American LNG tankers. You know, you go and you look back at the charts and the graphs on all this. And this development of liquid natural gas in the U.S. occurs in the last 10 or 12 years. And it coincides directly with the American shift that you saw in the Obama administration to where, yeah, we had a pretty difficult relationship with Russia. You know, certainly we discussed that earlier, you know, to where, but however, where it's being spoken about, where the U.S. administrations are clearly saying that Russia is a principal adversary. Whereas before there wasn't such outright hostility. And then, of course, you know, you had the utilization of Russia as a villain in the 2016 elections. I mean, so this is something that politically has been of great use, particularly the Democratic Party in the United States. But you see all that, and that coincides with the expansion around the East Coast and the Gulf of Mexico and on the Atlantic of liquid natural gas facilities for export. I mean, it's just, you know, if you just the charts, just, you know, clear 45-degree line, you know, going up in the sense of like this expansion of the ability of the Americans to export LNG. And certainly by the summer of this year, the United States had exported more LNG to Europe you know, than they had in the previous year or two combined, you know, in 6 months. Like, so it was like all those kinds of things. And then, of course, now the United States is the major supplier of LNG in the world. And that has a very, very real impact on American policy. It drives things. I think that was a fundamental driver behind the destruction of the Nord Stream 2 pipelines, right? As well as then, too, this other aspect of like, we're going to make the Russians hurt. And we're going to show them that we can go places here that they can't protect, and that we can do, you know, we're going to do this. And then in like a month or so later, the Kerch Bridge was destroyed. Right. And I don't know what else is in next, but there will be something coming next. And, you know, and the thing is, you had today in the United States a disruption of our air travel. One of the systems the FAA uses that allows planes to take off stopped working. So big disruption of air travel today in the United States. And, you know, it's more than likely it's because it's a systems collapse that our Department of Transportation has been so weakened. It doesn't do any regulation, on and on. We've had all kinds of other issues with our aspects of transportation in this country over the years. So I think this is just one more aspect of a system collapse of our transportation infrastructure due to neglect, due to outsourcing, due to deregulation, you know, but due to corruption, you know. But there also is, too, the very real thought: was this a cyber attack? Was this something, you know? So whether or not those things occur, actually occur, the thought's there. The likelihood is it. Was it
Mhm.
more than likely that it was because we haven't invested in our infrastructure? Yeah, it's probably that. But if I was betting $1, would I put a few cents or 10 cents or 15 cents that it was a Russian cyber attack? Yeah, I would. I mean, so you have that danger as we talk about escalation about, okay, where does it go? How's the Russians going to respond? The Russians can't be seen as not responding, both for internal reasons and external reasons. They have to show they're tough, but they also have people inside, just as the Americans, just as the Brits do, who are demanding a response. And so, yeah, it was incredibly stupid to do that. And you could see the reasons for it. And now the danger, of course, is where does it go?
Yeah, for the other officials who spoke about Nord Stream was actually Kalinda Rice. I think it was in 2014. You then have Trump having that argument with Jens Stoltenberg, where he's saying, we give all these NATO countries money to fight Russia, and then Russia is building a pipeline with Germany.
Yeah.
And then you even have Victoria Nuland in late 2021 also saying about bringing it to an end. So you've had lots of officials mentioning it. I'd like to ask you.
Well, one thing too is that for the Americans, you want to separate Western Europe from Russia as much as possible. I remember there was commentary early after the invasion because the Europeans were going to send $1 billion to Russia. I mean, to Ukraine, and the commentary was like, what does it matter? They're spending $1 billion a day on Russian energy. So they're going to spend $1 billion to Ukraine, but they're giving that every day to Russia. So there is that understanding that if you are serious about destroying Russia, if you're bringing it down, about collapsing the government and everything else, that you have to take away all its support. They've seen the disappointment. They have to be disappointed with how their sanctions didn't work. They have to be disappointed with where the war's at. So try and separate Europe as much as possible. And if that means destroying infrastructure, that's what you do.
Yeah, it's like Germany having an economic relationship with Russia means, they might become a better security one. There's more dialogue. And then they're like, Russia isn't this big foe that's made out to be. So I was going to ask, why do you think Europe puts up with this? Say it was the West, obviously, who blew up Nord Stream 2 or Nord Stream 1. Germany must know this. So why would Germany put up with this? Why does Europe not just say, we're sick of the US, of their demands, that it's meant to be NATO, but it's basically the US, and you're obviously being told what to do? Obviously, there was that Politico article, Europeans getting annoyed of the US basically profiteering of this with high, obviously, energy prices. Why did Europe put up with this? Did you see anything in your time when you was in the army with other NATO forces discussing this with you?
I think there are certainly those within European countries who benefit from who benefit from being the club. You have those who are neoconservatives, who are hawks, right? Who want to have their own strong military forces. There are those in Germany who really do want the German military to be getting 3% of GDP, right? There are those who are true believers in this. And I think they, in some way, see this as a way then to eventually distance themselves from the Americans because they'll be strong enough to stand on their own. I mean, I've heard a lot of that in the sense that there is this pushback about being under the wing or the umbrella of the United States, that they don't want that. And to do that, to be that way, though, they have to build up and they have to strengthen. So that means going along with these things for the time being. There are others who believe in this. There are certainly those who see Russia as an adversary, who see it as, for historical, cultural, political reasons, as someone worth opposing in this sense. There are those who are romantics about the American ideal. I mean, I've met Europeans who believe that United States really does have the best interests for the world, and that this may not be perfect, but it's better. So these are kind of those who fall into the end of history, class of civilizations camps. So I think there's a variety of reasons why there is support. Some of it's because it's expedient. The United States is a better bet than Russia or China or whoever, that we're a small nation. We have to ally ourselves with somebody. So there's kind of a realpolitik to it, right? Of like, well, we've got to choose somebody. We might as well choose the Americans, and then there's fear. We don't want to upset the Americans. The Americans will play hardball. I can tell you that. I did work a number of years ago, 12 years ago, with the Dutch intelligence folks, and went to The Hague a couple times. And they told me that when Holland was considering pulling its forces out of Afghanistan, the Americans told them they would stop their shipping into Rotterdam if they did so. Right. So there's that fear. What are the repercussions going to be? So there's a lot of it. And then, like anywhere else, like as you kind of brought up, everyone is facing this economic turmoil. Very few nations are not experiencing these brutal and really hard cost of living increases. It's a crisis for so many people. And so I think for many politicians, this isn't the fight they want to have. They've got other issues. They've got higher priorities. They've got domestic priorities. And this thing is too much for them. It's too. So I think there's a lot of different ways you can look at it to kind of understand, why do they keep going along with it? Why do they continue to go with a policy that is madness, that is leading towards further escalation, that could lead into nuclear catastrophe, right? But also, too, is something that has worsened their own situations in the present, right? This war has made inflation much, much, much worse. So, why do they go along with it and everything, and why they do it? I think there's a number of reasons for it. And a number of good reasons, unfortunately.
I'm sure there's a few reasons. Like I remember reading, I'm not sure if it was Hillary Clinton's emails about Libya, and obviously Gaddafi was there. A lot of their resources were nationalized, and there was just this whole bit all about all these European countries, so Britain, France, obviously spearheaded that in Libya, and then also Italy, Sweden, all these companies all just trying to get their hands on it. So the US obviously normally puts up the biggest military force, so reaps the biggest rewards. But then they know, the country might be privatized because that's obviously encouraged, and their companies can get in there. So I'm sure that might play a part, or a small part. I'm not sure, but as you said, there's probably many reasons.
Certainly they want to make sure they get a cut. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, you could always think, oh, Europe could unite against the US, but there's going to be countries in there who go off and tell the US, hey, there's this big plan of all these European countries who basically want to, stop basically being your big ally. Britain, especially, would never go along with that, because we basically obviously still piggyback off the Americans after obviously the British Empire collapsed to become a junior partner. So there's no way we'd ever. Yeah. We've been probably the strongest ally in this war. Poland's been pretty strong, but the Brits are right there with the US, and they might be getting a bit too big for their boots. If it was us versus Russia, we wouldn't stand a chance. But obviously, with the Americans, we can be a bit more brazen, can't we?
Yeah, and there's institutional reasons for it. There's personal reasons for it. Certainly when we were talking about Stoltenberg before, and the Norwegians dropped the most bombs of any, if I'm remembering this correctly, the Norwegians dropped the most bombs of any NATO air force in Libya. And if you go back and you look at what was occurring, where the Norwegians were trying to intercede and serve as intermediaries, and were proving somewhat successful in that Libyan civil war, that is put to an end. And then the NATO bombing campaign begins, and the Norwegians drop the most bombs, and then Stoltenberg ultimately becomes NATO General Secretary. So there's a lot of personal valuation and aspiration and inducements that are involved in here. Just as you said, these nations all have their military industries, and it's important. If you want to matter, if you're the Royal Navy, and you want to justify new nuclear submarines or whatever, or if you want to justify having your ships conducting operations in the Strait of Taiwan, you need to be allied with the Americans. So there's all types of value to this. Whether it be to individuals or corporations or to institutions that, yeah, make this an absolute gold mine.
We've gone over an hour, so I'll start trying to wrap it up with a few more questions. I just had one that's sort of not the best for ending it, but just how does this compare to the proxy in Syria, like escalation wise? Because I was too young to understand what's going on then, but it would feel like maybe the escalation now, how involved we are in Ukraine, is a much bigger scale than Syria. Or, being there at the time, obviously, I'm sure you would have followed it very closely. How does it compare tension-wise in the media, in the public, and the government's dialogue-wise?
Media-wise, it's very similar in the sense that the American media and the British media were so on an anti-Assad narrative. And again, another war where there are no good sides. There's such an anti-Assad narrative that the various jihadist forces that were there, the Al Qaeda and the Islamic State, and then all the offshoots and name changes and everything else that occurred. But these forces that so quickly overwhelmed and took control of the insurgency, of the revolution, the rebellion, whatever you want to call it, they were characterized as the good guys. And so you have that very simple binary discussion of the war as rebels against the government, this dictator, rebels against a dictator. And so even when the war was so multi-sided that it would take you, to write it out would take you a couple of pages to who's on what side, who's fighting who's allied with who, it was always described as a two-sided fight, to the point that where you had when the Kurds are fully involved, and they were really from the get-go too, but you have to put the Kurds, the Syrian Democratic Forces, as they're called, and there is no mention that this was really a Kurdish separatist a fight that had been going on for a very long time, and a lot of history to it, and then to explain how Turkey's involved in that and how they're on and on and on. It was just described as, as an A versus B. And at some point it was described then as A versus B versus C, where it was the Assad government, Al Qaeda, and because the Americans just called everything Al Qaeda, and then the Kurds, but it's called the Syrian Democratic Forces. And even though it was almost all, so it was always a very simplified narrative, and it didn't serve anyone any justice in doing that, because it was much, much more complicated than that. And yeah, again, there was no good sides in it, and so I think you had very great similarity in that. I think a lot of us in the U.S. point to that, to point to other wars and occupations and that the United States has conducted as a warning. Look, I had there have been a number of leaks that have confirmed this, but I remember in the summer of 2012 going to meet a friend of mine in D.C. who was a senior officer with the Defense Intelligence Agency on the Iraq desk, and he was just absolutely beside himself because the decision had been made to arm the jihadist groups in Syria, thinking that they could be controlled in order to bring down Assad, and of course it blew up just as he thought it would, just as others would say it would, just as people expected. You can't control these things. You created a Frankenstein's monster, and so that is the fear, I think, that many people have with the Ukrainians, that their right-wing elements, many of which are described as Nazi-like, would play that type of role in Ukraine that the Islamic reactionary jihadist elements did in Syria. And then they, of course, they crossed the imaginary line in the sand and went back into Iraq, where many of them had come from. So the lack of foresight, the lack of the ability for the U.S. officials to say, if we do A and then B happens, what are the likely scenarios that are going to come after that? You see that over and over again, where there's not that type of forward thinking, where the branches aren't suspected, where it is just assumed that it's all going to work out, or there's no thought past what comes next. What comes after what comes next is never discussed. So I think there's a lot of similarities with that as well, too. The scale of the violence in Syria was massive. The country was destroyed. Over 500,000 people were killed. More than a third of the people were displaced. So I think we haven't seen that level of destruction yet in Ukraine, but it's only a year in. And so I think that's where it could go.
Actually, I was going to ask you a question, but just to back up what you said, there was that leaked tape with John Kerry in 2016. Mm-hmm. He was obviously Secretary of State under Obama, where he says, "We thought we could manage." We was watching ISIS. We thought we could manage it. We thought it would bring Assad to the negotiation table. We could use it as leverage, but instead, Russia and Putin came in. I can put that in the show notes, but specifically about Syria. I meant more, the tension between Russia and the US, as in that was a proxy war, but this seems like it's a proxy war on a much larger and riskier scale. So what was the tension like between Russia and the US and the sort of dialogue between them?
There were many of us who were aghast that the United States was going to put forces into Syria, including aircraft, that would come into contact with Russian forces. The danger of that. And, thankfully, nothing ever occurred that wasn't able to be controlled. But I think that was more a matter of luck and maybe the cool heads of the commanders on the ground than anything else. But we never had the retaliation against one another because of destruction. And the United States did kill Russian forces over there. There was an airstrike that killed a large number of Russian mercenaries. So there is, there was always a fear that this was going to escalate into something. An American aircraft would shoot down a Russian aircraft, and Russian air defenses would shoot down an American aircraft retaliation. And then where would that go from there? You'd have hardliners in both the U.S. and Russia demanding for something else, right? That was the great fear, that we would start killing each other in Syria, and then it would just expound out of there. It did a number of things in terms of preparing for this war. It gave the Russian military, particularly its special operations people and its air force, the ability to train, to practice, to get better at what they're doing. They were able to kind of show up in a war where they could control the tempo of what they were doing, because they weren't facing a conventional peer force, right? The Russian Air Force could launch airstrikes as it chose in Syria. They didn't have the urgency or the pressure that they're under with the war in Ukraine. They certainly weren't facing air defenses like the Ukrainians have, right? I mean, the same thing too with the Russian Special Operations Forces, and then some of their ground commanders. And then, of course, for their staffs and their logistics people, this is all an opportunity to get it right. Also a chance to mobilize their industry to ensure that they could get enough, air-launched ground attack munitions as they could, and how they could surge, and all these kind of things. So the Syrian war really helped prepare the Russian military for this war in Ukraine. It also, in terms of, it gave a personality to the Russian armed forces that they didn't have previously. They have now a pride, I think, that they intervened in the Syrian war. They saved the Syrian government. They defeated the Islamic State. There is a degree, I think, to their personal pride that has assisted them going forward in this war in Ukraine, that I think it's not very calculable, but I think it's there. As well as, too, the further aspects of, look, we stood up to the Americans in Syria. We're going to stand up to them again in Ukraine. We stood up to them in Georgia. We'll stand up to them again in Ukraine. I mean, so all these things build upon each other. In the United States, we have this really incredible desire to put everything in boxes, to put everything in its own separate compartments, and that somehow the war in Syria can't touch the war in Ukraine, and that there's nothing to do between them. And the commentary on this is just idiotic. But that's how it's discussed. if you were to go on an American media network and try and speak about the war of Syria and war in Ukraine, the way they're intertwined as we are here, they'd look at you like you had three heads. So, I mean, you certainly had, those kinds of things that help set the stage for the Russian military in its invasion, last year.
Okay, last couple of questions here. Should be fairly short. Just want to know your honest opinion on Russia and China domestically and internationally, maybe more China. Obviously, there's constant claims about China. They haven't really had much of a overseas military presence like the US and NATO. So what is your honest assessment of Russia and China? Because no obviously government is normally honest and innocent.
Right.
So obviously I'm sure you're not too up to date on their domestic policies, but if you are, I was just interested to see your thoughts on it, aside from what the US and NATO has done in the world.
Well, I mean, neither are places I'd want to live. Put it that way. I mean, they are authoritarian regimes. I mean, you certainly see with, say, the media crackdown in Russia, which is replicated a lot of ways in Ukraine as well. But at least the Ukrainians were invaded and occupied, so you can kind of somehow justify their media crackdown and their political crackdowns. But it's certainly, I think, with the Chinese, what they're going through with COVID right now, with what we saw with the protests that they had at the end of last year, that a lot of them had to do with COVID, but there is also too, I think there is much deeper and greater anger, societal anger that was pent up. I think militarily, Russia has shown itself to be capable at waging a limited war in Ukraine. Much more capable than it seems as if Russia has been painted two ways in the West, either as losing the war in Ukraine, completely incompetent. Okay, well then why are we so concerned? Why are we saying that everybody in NATO has to spend 3% of their GDP? Why are we, have a $858 billion U.S. defense budget if the Russians are losing this war against Ukraine? And then the others are saying, oh my God, Russia's going to invade and conquer all of Europe. And it's like they're what, 40 or 50, they've been able to take 40 or 50 kilometers west of their own nation. That's it, for a war that they've been preparing for decades. That's all they've been able to do, right? So now I think their goals are limited, right? But I don't think the Russians ever had the ability to take Kyiv, say. And I think they knew it. I think that was a feint that was meant to try and produce early negotiations, try and get your hand wrapped around the throat of your enemy, right, and force them to negotiate. I think that's what that thrust was. And when the negotiations failed, that thrust, immediately fell back, right? And then they went into the east full hard. A number of different things that had, of course, pulled Ukrainian forces away from the east. I mean, so I think it was a good plan on their part, but it's limited. It's not going to conquer all of Ukraine, let alone then go to Poland next. I think, okay, so if that's who they really are, why are we so concerned about them? The other thing then too is with the Chinese, the one thing I will say about the Chinese as they grow and build their military, which they are doing, which has a lot to do with, for 25 some odd years, the Americans sailing aircraft carriers up to their coastline and humiliating them. And them saying, Chinese saying, if you keep doing this, we're going to have to respond. And now they are. They've got an aircraft carrier on their own. But more importantly, they've gone from where they had 300 nuclear weapons for decades. They are now building over 1,000 nuclear weapons. I mean, so this is all very dangerous. I will say about the Chinese, and you're talking about a country that has, I think, 2 overseas military bases, both in Africa, and they're more commercial than they are military by any understanding of them. You see it in their film industry, though, that they are preparing their public for future wars, for future overseas military adventures. You have some very big films coming out of China that have done well internationally. There's a series called the Wolf Warrior series, which I think are the biggest revenue for Chinese film. And it's a commando film, an Arnold Schwarzenegger type kind of thing, Jason Statham kind of, super soldier killing the terrorists kind of thing. But there's other films like that. And of course, there was the big film last year they had on the Korean War out of the Chinese film industry. And I think that might have been their biggest film of all time, actually. And again, that was about intervening in Korea to stop the Americans from invading China. That's how it's told. And so you see, I think, with the film industry, along with this burgeoning military industrial complex, and then along with unrest, domestic political unrest, well, everyone will tell you, going back through the Greeks, right? You've got a problem at home, start a problem abroad and distract your people from it. So I look at those things with the Chinese, and then of course the continual bullying by the Americans, this insane desire to have China as an enemy, for a bunch of different reasons. But I say, okay, I think the Chinese really are preparing to step into that role of being a worldwide military power. They're preparing their people. They've got domestic reasons for it. They've got this. They're building they've got a military industrial complex of their own now. Fantastic. That's great. That's all the world needed. Another one of those, right? I mean, so I think that's where you're heading Chinese, militarily. I don't know if that means at some point they will do something drastic towards Taiwan, or whether it's just they want to be able to have, naval surface warfare groups off the coast of Africa at all times. I'm not sure where they're going with it, but I definitely think that's what they're doing. And certainly we see that with their outlays with their expenditures, with what they're building, everything else.
Yeah, I'm tempted to obviously talk about Taiwan, but we will leave that because otherwise we will keep going. So just for the final question, where do you see the war going? Is it going to continue escalating too far? Can Ukraine hold out for stalemate to a sort of Afghan-Soviet war? I know it's completely different, but can they hold out? Or is Russia now obviously ramping everything up? Are they just going to steamroll Ukraine eventually? Can the US NATO support continue? It's got to end at some point. We can't just keep throwing money at it. Where is this going to lead?
Well, certainly the Americans, we can throw as much money as we want at it forever. We spent $300 million a day in Afghanistan. And I think the Russians continue to dig in. If the Russian goals are the way, or what I think they are, that they just want the East, they just want Donbass, they just want, and that connection to Crimea, they just want that. And then they're going to sit behind, they're going to sit in their bunkers and their trenches and hold that line. Then such a war then that way is sustainable for a very, very long time. Barring any type of unforeseen cataclysmic event, and some type of resource collapse or some type of coup that's unexpected, I don't see the Russians changing from that. And I think they have the ability to support that for a very long time. And the dangerous thing is if there is a coup in Russia, I believe it's going to be I believe it will be a right-wing coup, because there are people to the right of Putin. And there are people who don't think he's strong enough, he's not nationalist enough, he's not done enough to confront the Americans. So that's the danger, and of course the same thing in Ukraine. If there was a coup, it'd be a right-wing one, and that's not going to bring about peace. It's only going to bring about a continuation of the war. So I think if the war continues in a stalemate fashion, if the Russians achieve their goals in the next few months and are able to kind of solidify a line of defense where they control what their gains that they've made over the last year, the two sides settle into long-range artillery fire, missile attacks, drone attacks, and I think that's the war for the next several years, eventually settling down into a de facto settlement that way. And you see that all throughout. I mean, basically, hey, we've had how many years of the Taiwan-China type of relationship, right? And so the Ukrainians will claim Donbass as their own. The Russians will say, nope, it's ours. Crimea is ours, and it's just kind of like this. Well, what are you going to do? Who's going to intervene and stop this? Who's going to fix it? And neither side militarily has it. And then I think neither side militarily wants to advance, because they know it's fruitless. They know it's not, there's no victory there, unless you get more extreme leadership in either Russia or Kyiv that are so ideologically bent on destroying their enemy that they will pursue further war. So I think that's where it's going to go. there is, of course, the dangers of escalation, and we've certainly talked about that. Quite a bit. But I don't think if it follows that path, which I could be completely wrong, and I just said to you all before, like, right, if anyone tells you they don't that that's going to happen, doesn't know, I mean, so saying that, and it's dry. I mean, there's an American baseball player named Yogi Berra, right? He's had these quips and witticisms, and one of his, things is predictions are hard, especially when they're about the future. So you have where it could go otherwise, though, certainly where you have escalations, you could have provocations or accidents or misunderstandings that lead into a growth of the conflict. But fortunately, I don't see that happening right now, although the danger is there, and that's why it's so important. Look, even if it's only a 1% chance of escalation, that means everything then, in the sense that negotiations and ending this war have to be a priority. And then, of course, there's the reason to end the war for the sake of the suffering. Again, this is a war with no good sides, and people are dying in a pointless conflict here. This is something that could be all the disagreements over the commerce, the trade, the political circumstances of Eastern Ukraine. All of those things can be rectified at the negotiating table. And none of them are going to be rectified, of course, by killing tens of thousands of people. So, but for right now, I think the stalemate's going to continue. I mean, definitely maybe come back a few months, see where that's at once we've gotten to spring, where that's at. But, that stalemate with that ever-present danger of something forcing this to go out of control. I think this is why you haven't seen the Belarusians enter the war. It might be because their army is not capable or competent to do so. But I think it's also, too, because the Russians don't want to escalate the war further by bringing in another nation. And, that would allow then the Poles to enter or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, no, the suffering on both sides, because at the end of the day, whatever you think about the Russian government, the Ukrainian government, generally on both sides, it's normal people. You could say the same about World War One.
Yeah.
Whatever you think about the Kaiser or,
Right.
the British Empire, it's just working class people caught in a political game, basically as pawns on the geopolitical chessboard, really, isn't it?
That's exactly right. The mothers and fathers who today are being told by the Russian government their sons were killed in Ukraine are working class people. That's who this is. And it's the same story that goes back millennia.
Forever.
Yeah, forever. It's the poor, it's the working class that die in these wars, that die and suffer in these wars. It's their mothers and fathers that live the rest of their lives in grief. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, thanks for the interview. I very much enjoyed it. Do you want to let people know where they can find you? The think tank, any articles, different news organizations, independent or not, you've written articles for recently and plan to?
Yeah. So I'm with an organization called the Eisenhower Media Network. Please check us out. It's a collection of American anti-war veterans who speak out against militarism. But also I'm attached with the Center for International Policy, and you can find me on Twitter at Matthew Hoh, P as in Patrick. And so, yeah, please follow me there, and definitely send me a note and DMs. Happy to talk and discuss these kinds of things anytime.
Thank you, Matt. I will put that on the show notes. And again, thank you for coming on.
Thank you, man.